This podcast is brought to you by the friendly people at Crembo Baked Goods, the San Francisco Bay Area's newest parve non-dairy kosher bakery, proudly serving cookies, loaf cakes, and the best gluten-free challah I've ever had, and much more. Ask about their challah delivery service to schools, organizations, and corporations in the Bay Area. Email them at orders@crembobakedgoods.com for more info, or simply go to Crembo, that's Krembo, bakedgoods.com. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Holy Sparks podcast. Saul K here, back after our break from Hanukkah. Super excited for yet another quality guest. And without further ado, let me introduce and edify the man properly. Rabbi Zvika Krieger is the spiritual leader of Chochmat Halev, a progressive spiritual community in Berkeley, California, for embodied prayer and mindfulness, heart-centered connections, and mystical wisdom. He is the co-founder of Shevet, Jewish Mindfulness Collective, and has served in board and leadership positions for Sukkat Shalom, Milk+Honey Camp at Burning Man, Jewish Studio Project, DC Minyan, and other organizations dedicated to nourishing the mind, body, and soul. He has a BA from Yale University and studied at Yeshivat Shaarei Mevaseret Zion and American University in Cairo. He is a certified shadow work facilitator and design thinking facilitator and trained as an ecstatic dance DJ by Embodied Sound. He is ordained as a rabbi in the Hasidic and Jewish Renewal lineages. Originally from Los Angeles, Zvika loves to surf, dance, backpack, rock climb, and sing karaoke, occasionally on key. Zvika, welcome to the Holy Sparks podcast.
Thanks for having me here.
Absolute pleasure. And you know, Zvika and I met in silence on a 6-day retreat, and we're around each other for a long time in silence, which is a really cool way to meet each other. But for people that aren't familiar with you, I want to kind of take it from the top and share with our audience a little bit about your youth, specifically growing up Jewish in LA, and what type of Jewish community and environment you were in.
Thanks for the question, and thanks for having me on the show. Great to be here. So I grew up in Los Angeles, as you mentioned, and I grew up in the Orthodox community there. There's a really tight-knit, strong Orthodox community there. And I would say, unlike most people who grow up in the Orthodox community and then eventually become a little bit more progressive, I actually look back very warmly on my time in the Orthodox community. I had a really good experience there. I had a wonderful group of friends. It was a very loving and supportive community, not without its problems, certainly in retrospect, but I went to great schools, was part of great youth groups and organizations. And I would say, particularly now looking back on it, what I really appreciate was the depth of the experience and the depth of the knowledge that I gained. I went to yeshiva day school for all of my schooling and studied in yeshiva in Israel after high school. And really what that did is it gave me that deep access to Jewish texts, to Jewish wisdom, to liturgy, to Jewish legal codes and canons. It gave me a sense of empowerment over my own religious experience, in the sense that I didn't have to rely on gatekeepers who have their own social agendas that they're trying to layer on top of the tradition, but I could actually go straight to the sources and see what the sources say and make my own judgments about what I want my Jewish practice to look like. And so, oftentimes people would say, this is Jewish, that is Jewish. And I'd say, well, show me the sources. Where does it say that? Or I can do things that others would consider maybe radical or a little bit more creative. And I can say, look, it's right here in the Talmud, it's right here in the Shulchan Aruch, the Jewish legal codes, whatever it may be. And so I really left with this sense of deep empowerment and ability to, I don't know if customize is the right word, because that has a little bit of a narcissistic element to it. But it gave me the opportunity to be creative in the ways that our ancestors were deeply creative. And I think that the challenge is that I think a lot of people who don't have access to the original source material tend to default to the most conservative interpretations of those materials. But the more access you have, the more you can see the deeply creative, deeply innovative, deeply progressive strands that have always been there in our tradition. And so I feel very grateful to that upbringing for giving me that empowerment. And that has served me both in my professional life, particularly as I've stepped into being a professional Jewish communal leader, though I've been leading Jewish communities for most of my life. But it's also served me in my personal life in being able to find and create and craft a Judaism that is meaningful and resonant for me.
I love it. Wow, what a nice framing up. And in music, we always say you have to know the rules before you break them, right? So, sort of a similar parallel here. And so, when you say access, for clarification of people that are listening, what I hear is understanding the original Hebrew, being able to translate directly from sources like you referenced Shulchan Aruch or Talmud. Is that specifically what you're referencing, being without a gatekeeper, whether it's a teacher or community, being in between you and the material? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I would say language is definitely a big part of it, both Hebrew and Aramaic, but also just having spent, 12 hours a day studying these materials and having them, from when I was in kindergarten until I was, through college and beyond, having access, being just deeply steeped in the material. There's a whole universe of Jewish ancestral texts and sources that reference each other and build on each other and hyperlink to each other. And so when there's a reference in one source, the Talmud or wherever it may be doesn't necessarily tell you what it's referencing. And so the way that you know that is just through depth of immersion in the sources. And so being able to draw links and parallels just through the sheer volume of things that I was exposed to. And I don't say this to sort of toot my own horn, but so to say, like, I'm very deep in a very narrow subsection of both human knowledge and Jewish knowledge, because as much as I was deeply immersed in an Orthodox worldview, I knew very little about progressive Judaism, and that's only something that I've come to learn over the past 5-10 years. I've still actually never been to a Reform synagogue before or a Reconstructionist synagogue, and probably can count on one hand how many times I've been to a conservative synagogue. And so I think that I'm deep in a narrow subset of the tradition, and certainly spending all of that time deeply immersed in Jewish sources came at the cost of immersing in other wisdom traditions. And that's something that I've been doing a lot in this last decade of my life to complement all the time I spent in the Jewish tradition.
Nachon, I love it. And so also just for further clarification, Orthodox is a broad category. There's a lot of substrata within that. So can you just niche down a little bit to, was it like Hasidic or modern Orthodox or Haredi or whatever? There's a lot of different options there. So maybe you can dial it in a little bit.
Yeah, so my parents got married when they were in their early 20s, and then got divorced 1 year later, and I was born in that 1 year period. And it's a long story that we don't have time for here, but I'll say that I grew up between two different kinds of Orthodox worlds. My dad is Haredi, ultra Orthodox, and lived first in Monsey, New York, and then in Israel. And so I spent part of my life in that world. And then my mother lived in Los Angeles, and she was in the, I guess what one might call mainstream Orthodox world, right? The kind of centrist Orthodox maybe is the right term. My dad's side were, I think, 8th or 9th generation Jerusalemites. And my family has deep roots in Jerusalem. My great uncle was the rabbi of the Great Synagogue in Jerusalem, right there on King George Street. And my grandmother's family was very close to Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. And so that kind of will give you a sense of the kind of orthodoxy that, I mean, for those who are in the know of those nuances, that was sort of the kind of orthodoxy on my dad's side. On my mom's side, my grandfather on my mom's side was the president of the Orthodox Union in the OU. My mom attended Stern College, which is the women's college of Yeshivat University. So maybe that'll give you kind of a taste of the worlds. Those are the two worlds that I straddled. And from an outsider's perspective, one would say like, oh, they're both Orthodox, and so they're the same. But as you sort of correctly intimated in your question, there are a lot of nuances within the Orthodox world, and I did have to code switch and flow between those different worlds, particularly as a young child.
Oh, absolutely. That was great. And those worlds, there's a lot of overlap, but they are wildly differentiated as well if you've experienced the different ones. So interesting. But I did a little digging, and your before and after photos in your Facebook tech world and now are just epic. I encourage you to A/B them. It's great. That's like you just look so happy and joyful now. I'm sure you're happy there as well. But tell me a little bit. You were had this unique role at Facebook in terms of responsible innovation, and I think that ties in with ethics a little bit. But tell me a little bit about that work and how it, worked out, or if it didn't, so which is why you left.
You shared my bio at the top of the show, and you honed in on the various Jewish organizations and work that I've been involved in. But the reality is that most of my professional life has not been in the Jewish world. And I've had a very eclectic, eccentric career that's taken me from journalism to government to teaching, design world, NGO, nonprofit, civil society world, and to my last job before I became a rabbi of working at Facebook, well, now known as Meta. At the time it was called Facebook. And my job was director of responsible innovation and head of ethics. And essentially the job there is that they hired me to set up a team that would review all the different products that the company was developing. And that's across Facebook app, Instagram, WhatsApp, Messenger, the VR, virtual reality and augmented reality products, all the different ads and marketing products that they were developing. So, across hundreds of different product areas, to review the products and make sure that, or help the product teams anticipate the ways in which those products might harm people, and then help them mitigate those potential harms. And so I did that for a couple of years. It was an incredibly rewarding and challenging job. It was interesting going from government, where it was incredibly difficult to have impact as an individual. And sometimes you'd be working on one policy for years and years and years before you saw it actually getting any sort of traction. Whereas at a company like Meta, you could identify a potential harm in a product, and the next day, the product team will have made a change to address that potential harm. And then 4 billion people would be using a different product. So the scale of impact was pretty tremendous, and just how interesting and uncharted so many of the issues were. Like, it often wasn't like it was often the first time that we were ever dealing with something, because the technology was so cutting edge at a company like Meta. And so I really enjoyed working there, and ended up leaving just because after a couple of years of doing that, I was totally burnt out. And the pace is really relentless. You can imagine, even though I had 40 people on this team that I had built, it was just very exhausting, staying up late at night after putting my son to bed, getting back on the computer, just because of the pace of products that are being released in the company.
Can you give us an example of one tweak or adjustment you made to a product that sort of improved the ethical efficiency or zeitgeist in which it functioned?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, we're bound by some pretty strict non-disclosure agreements, and sort of, aren't able to talk publicly about a lot of the work that I did there. My team and I worked with over 120 different products at the company. There are a few things that I can share maybe at a high level to give you a sense of the kinds of issues that we grappled with. One thing I'll say is that, I was there at the company when the company was making a big transition to something called end-to-end encryption, which is that particularly on messaging apps where the company does not have access to the content of your message. And you would think that that would be like a sort of undisputed, like a positive thing to be doing, right? And particularly from the perspective of privacy, that was the gold standard, right? You don't want any company to have access to what people are saying in your private messages, whether it's on WhatsApp, whether it's on Messenger, whether it's on your DMs and Instagram. But the trade-off of implementing end-to-end encryption is that the company doesn't have access to the content of your messages. So it's actually very hard for the company to curb any dangerous or nefarious behavior that's happening in those private chats. And so things like child pornography or human trafficking or violent extremist groups using the platforms to plan their activities, or the proliferation of misinformation, all of that happening within end-to-end encryption, it's very difficult and almost impossible to even know that that behavior is happening, let alone curb it. And so a lot of the work that we did was not saying, here's the right way and the wrong way to proceed, but it was a lot of the way we framed it is it's not right versus wrong, but right versus right. That, is it more important to protect people's privacy, or is it more important to have access to what's happening in these chats so that you can curb challenging behaviors, and so, or to curb dangerous or harmful behaviors. And so a lot of the work that my team did was help product teams frame up those trade-offs and then help them be intentional about articulating their values and why you would choose to lean on one side or the other, or when possible, to think about what a win-win is, that it's not necessarily like disassemble a false binary and say like, it has to be this or that. Well, is there a technical solution that could address both needs? And we had on our team, we also had a lot of technical folks who could work with the product teams, not just conceptually, but really dig in on the coding and the product development side as well.
Oh, great. Fascinating. Oh, I love it. So important.
And it is interesting. Like a lot of people who only know me professionally were saying like, oh my God, it's such a crazy sort of sharp turn you took going from tech to being a rabbi. And, partially that it's those people don't realize that I've been doing Jewish communal service and Jewish work for many decades, just on the nights and weekends. But also in many ways, like I actually felt that the work that I was doing at Facebook felt very rabbinic in an interesting way. Like a lot of people called me the Facebook rabbi, which was very funny. But I think that there's a parallel into how I do my rabbinic work and how I worked at Facebook, that at Facebook, a lot of the engineers and the product teams would come to me and they would bring a product and they would say, okay, help us surface potential harms. We'll work with them in that. And they'll say, okay, well, tell us what to do. Like, what's the right answer? And I would say, no, my job is not to tell you what to do. My job is to walk beside you and help you tap into your own moral compass, help you articulate your values and let those values drive your decision-making. And I have a similar approach to being a rabbi, right? A lot of people will come to me and say, hey, I'm facing this very difficult challenge in my life, and can you tell me what to do? And I'll often say, no, it's not my job to tell you what to do, but I can walk beside you and support you in articulating your values and connecting to that own voice of the divine that speaks within you, and to act from that place. It was in a weird way, they both, it did feel like a very rabbinic role.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see the dovetail there. So let's move forward to, you described to me when we first met that you were leading services at Milk+Honey and Burning Man for thousands of people, and either someone suggested you become a rabbi or there's some tie in there. So walk us through from there to, and you can tell us if it was from there to Aleph or Yeshivat Shaarei Mevaseret Zion, or how that progression worked out.
Yeah. So, I never really considered becoming a rabbi earlier in my life. It's funny because once I finally became a rabbi, all of my friends who I grew up with were like, oh yeah, of course. We always knew you were going to be a rabbi. And so, we're always the last to find out about ourselves, even if everybody else saw it in me. I think I got the message growing up in the community I grew up in that people who were Jewish people who worked in the Jewish world just did that because they couldn't get jobs in the real world, which is obviously not true and a horrible thing to say. But I think I got that message. And that wasn't helped by going to Yale for undergrad, which was a huge culture shock for me in many ways, but just being thrust into this elitist world, careerist, accomplishment driven, people that your self-worth is wrapped up in, working in fancy companies or in government, high levels of government, and that there was a very narrow definition of success that I really took on as an impressionable, 19, 20-year-old when I went there from my little cocoon in the orthodox world to this sort of world of prep school graduates and movers and shakers. And it's in many ways taken me a few decades to unlearn the values that I learned in that experience. And so that's to say that I didn't see being a rabbi as sort of something that was considered like the definition of success. And I don't regret the path that I took, because I really loved all of the work that I did, whether in government or in journalism or in civil society or in the private sector. And I think it actually makes me a better rabbi, the fact that I have all those experiences. But it was a pretty circuitous route because of that, those messages that internalized. And I would say the thing that really started to shift for me was, first of all, in my 20s and 30s, I didn't I increasingly felt like I didn't fit in traditional Orthodox spaces. And I just found that the services were pretty uninspiring, what a lot of people call like the mumble bubble of like, like you're not like prayers are not actually, you're trying to say so many words, get through hundreds of pages in the prayer book in like a short 1 hour period. And so, or not 1 hour, like 2 hour period. And so there's not a lot of focus on what are we actually saying? Why are we saying? There wasn't, I had gotten very into mindfulness, and that's something that wasn't very in meditation, and that wasn't really mainstream in the Jewish world. Embodiment, there wasn't a lot of embodiment, and there wasn't joy or fun, and or really any sense of passion. But also, like, the Orthodox world is pretty socially conservative. And so I felt increasingly not at home, both in the uninspiring services and the social conservatism of that world. But I also didn't feel at home in more progressive spaces because I didn't grow up in that world, and it felt very foreign to me. And it also felt very thin to me in terms of like Jewish content. And so in my 20s and 30s, I ended up doing a lot of like pop-up stuff of like, I'm like, okay, like I need to create spaces for myself because I don't fit in to the spaces that exist right now. And I want to pray with other people. So I'm going to invite other people into those spaces, and maybe they'll resonate and maybe they won't. And they started to resonate. And I think increasingly people started turning to me to saying, oh, like you're like the most Jewishly knowledgeable person in our lives. Cause like a lot of the people that I was engaging with were very not Orthodox and didn't have a deep Jewish knowledge or background. And so people started saying like, hey, can you officiate our wedding? Can you officiate a baby naming? Can you officiate a funeral? And I was like, yeah, I can do that. I mean, like growing again, like having that knowledge from the Orthodox world, like I know how to just like open up the sources to guide me in that. And what I really loved doing was creating sort of creative rituals, like taking the scaffolding of the traditional rituals and saying, okay, how do we make this modern? How do we make this relevant? How do we bring in a sense of whimsy and delight and joyfulness and embodiment and stay true to the tradition, but also maybe excavate some deeper meaning that isn't immediately apparent on the surface. And so that was a lot of my 20s, and that's really and 30s, and that's what led me to the Milk+Honey camp at Burning Man. And so I think most people know what Burning Man is, but I'll just say it's this like 70,000, 80,000 person festival in the desert, in the Nevada desert, that brings people together from all over the world. And it's a pop-up city for 1 week. And there's lots of incredible art and music and interactive experiences and workshops and dancing and all sorts of great stuff there. And so for the past, how long has it been now? Almost a decade. I've been part of the leadership team of Milk+Honey, which is the Jewish camp at Burning Man. Camp's been around for about 15 years. And we do a lot of things, but one of the things that we do is we put on a big Shabbat prayer service at Burning Man on Friday night. And we have over 1,000 people who come attend that. And it's an incredible experience. And not only do we have the service, but then we cook Shabbat dinner for 1,000 people, and we lug out there, hundreds of challahs and bottles of wine, and cook all this food for people. So it's a really beautiful experience. And first of all, it's very meaningful for people to have that at Burning Man. And there's a lot of people who it's the only Jewish thing they do every year in their year. Like there's this sort of derisive phrase in the Jewish world called like once a year Jews. And it really refers to people who only go to services on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, and that's the only Jewish thing they do all year. Well, there's a different kind of once a year Jews, which is the only thing they do is they come to Shabbat at Burning Man. And there are people who they will not miss it. Like 2 years ago, you may have seen the headlines. There was this mud apocalypse, like one of the first times that were rained heavily at Burning Man. And so it was the whole area of Burning Man was covered in mud, and it's a couple miles wide. And so really the only way to get around is on bikes, but you couldn't ride your bikes. And so it was pouring rain, it was muddy everywhere. And it happened on Friday afternoon. And so we were like, okay, do we cancel Shabbat? Like, no one's going to be able to come because like, and you couldn't even really walk because the mud was so thick that if you walked like more than like a block or two, your boots were just like caked in these mud bricks. And so we were like, okay, well, usually we do it for 1,000 people. So we do it outside. And we were like, okay, well, it's raining, so we can't do that. And we don't have any sort of tarp. Well, we do have a shipping container that we use to carry all our stuff to Burning Man. Let's just empty out the shipping container and maybe we could do Shabbat services in there. But we were like, nobody's going to come. I don't know. And then like people started showing up out of the woodwork. Hundreds of people showed up in the rain, in the mud. People walked for like 5 or 6 miles in the mud to get there. Like, I will not miss Shabbat at Burning Man. Like it was just so incredible. And so we had a couple hundred people crammed into the shipping container, like singing Shabbat melodies. And it was just like so beautiful. Anyway, so I've led Shabbat there, co-led Shabbat there for the past few years. And first of all, I noticed that like every year it was a thing that I look forward to the most every year. It was like the highlight of my year, getting to design a service that was deeply meaningful and traditional, but also deeply subversive and weaving in more modern elements and making it feel relevant in a place like Burning Man, but also staying true to the tradition and the liturgy. And so it's just really fun for me to weave that together. And then after the service, people would like line up for like hours to talk to me. And they would just say, oh, Rabbi, thank you so much. I haven't been to a Jewish service in 20 years. I've never been to a Jewish prayer service before. I haven't been to a synagogue since my bar mitzvah. I've never had a Jewish experience until now that felt meaningful. Thank you, Rabbi. And I was like, whoa, like, I'm not a rabbi. And then people would say like, oh, well, like where can I go to get this during the year? And I was like, nowhere. Like there's nowhere that has this. And I just, year after year doing this with thousands of people attending, hundreds of people lining up for hours just to talk to me for a few minutes. I was like, wow, there's a real subset of the Jewish world that is not getting served by what's available out there. And like, even though I could have never imagined myself being a rabbi, I was like, this is a community that I could serve, right? Like these are my people. This is the kind of Judaism that I want to create and that I want to create more opportunities for. And so I would say it's pretty accurate, going back to your question, to say that my experience at Burning Man is what inspired me to become a rabbi and to quit my job at Facebook Meta and to do this kind of spiritual work.
I love it. Okay, so I'm not familiar with Yeshivat Shaarei Mevaseret Zion. So tell us what that is, because I know that you also ended up at Aleph. So I'm not familiar with
Yeah, so I actually have 2 rabbinic ordinations. And so the Mevaseret is a traditional Orthodox yeshiva that's outside of Jerusalem. And it is a place where I did a lot of my more traditional Orthodox Jewish studying, 14 hours a day, studying mostly Talmud. It was actually an incredible experience to be deeply immersed in that world and to get deep familiarity with those texts and with those traditions. Some of the friends that I made there are like still some of my closest friends. Ideologically, I would not say it's where I'm at today, but I'm really grateful for the experience that I had there. And Aleph is, so for those who don't know, Aleph is the umbrella organization for the Jewish Renewal movement. And Jewish Renewal is a movement that was started, I don't know exactly when you would peg it, 60s, 70s, started by someone named Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who you referenced earlier, who migrated here from Europe during the Holocaust. And he was in the Chabad lineage. And so Chabad is one of the Hasidic sects. And he was actually one of the first people that was sent by the Chabad Rebbe to be a emissary to the college campuses. And the 2 first people that the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Chabad rabbi, sent out to college campuses were Reb Zalman and Reb Shlomo Carlebach, who's the other person you mentioned earlier. The 2 of them are very good friends. And now Chabad emissaries are ubiquitous on college campuses. But yeah, so Zalman started in that traditional Orthodox world. And as he spent more and more time on college campuses, he got exposed to, Christian mystics, to secular theology, to philosophy, to other worldviews, to Eastern religious traditions. And he sort of took his foundation in the traditional Orthodox world and expanded on it, and sort of created this fusion, this really beautiful fusion called Jewish Renewal, which really takes the depth and the ritual richness and the mindfulness components of Jewish tradition, and sort of melds them with a lot of, this what we call deep ecumenism, with a lot of the wisdom from other wisdom traditions, bringing in that sense of embodiment, joy, music, and bringing in deep sort of psycho-spiritual teachings, but also bringing in a deep sense of egalitarianism, equal opportunities for men and women, inclusion, LGBT inclusion, including Jews of color, and bringing in interfaith families, bringing in a deep environmental consciousness and a social justice consciousness. And so it's really this beautiful fusion. And actually, the way that I learned about Jewish renewal is by reading Reb Zalman's obituary in the New York Times. And so I never met Reb Zalman. I almost met him, which is by accident, which is a funny story for another time. But I remember reading his obituary and I was like, wow, like, who is this guy who seems to contain all the paradoxes that I contain? And I thought I was the only one that had all these paradoxes, where he kind of had this traditional Orthodox upbringing and deeply committed to the traditional to living a traditional life and connecting to traditional Judaism, but was also, doing acid with Timothy Leary and going and visiting the Dalai Lama and into singing and dancing and mindfulness and embodiment and progressive values. And so kind of sent me on this journey. But in the time I was living in DC, and it wasn't until I moved to the Bay Area, where I feel like is one of the few places where Jewish renewal is really thriving and you can experience Jewish renewal in its fullness. And so I was like, this is the Jewish renewal that I read about. And eventually I said, okay, this is the second place where I want to get my ordination and really get immersed in this lineage. And Aleph ordination program is really good at bringing in people from really diverse backgrounds and tailoring the program to what your needs are. And so it was a bit of an unconventional schooling, but it was really a wonderful experience. And I'm so grateful for everything I learned in that program.
I love it. Have you read the book by Michael Lerner, Jewish Renewal?
I have, yes.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, your concept of Jewish renewal now moving forward. I'm curious your thoughts about it as a movement, right? Or if some people have this idea that, I have so much to say about this, so I'll try to be short here. Baal Shem Tov really was our progenitor hippie Jew, right? I mean, going out in nature and meditating and embodied wisdom and all of that, right? So he was that of his time and started this whole lineage, which turned into more of an intellectual tradition through the Alter Rebbe, and then more ecstatic traditions through Reb Nachman and things like that. But how it is now, Jewish renewal, I'm always interested to see if it will be sort of absorbed into other denominations, or if, in my worldview, we're moving towards a post-denominational era. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, I'll just sort of two separate strands I'll go on here. One is just like talking about the connection between Jewish renewal and Hasidism. And it's interesting because in the popular discourse, people hear the word Hasidic and they think it's synonymous with like ultra Orthodox, but or the word Haredi in Hebrew. And actually, like, Hasidism was a spiritual revivalist revolution, right? It completely altered the face of Judaism and the texture of Judaism in the late 1700s, starting in the late 1700s in Eastern Europe. It was quite a radical movement that really deeply reinterpreted a lot of Judaism. And we could spend hours just talking about Hasidism, but I'll just say, like, to me, one of the most salient parts of Hasidism is that it took Jewish mysticism, things like Zohar and Kabbalah, and that were previously very esoteric and limited to only elite scholars, and they democratized access to Jewish mysticism. But the other thing that they did is Jewish mysticism up until Hasidism was primarily about mapping the celestial realms. And so like what's happening in heaven and the different sort of sphirot, the different emanations of the divine and creation myth and supernal realms and all of that. Very esoteric and frankly not really my jam. But what Jewish mysticism, what Hasidism did is it kind of took these maps of like the supernal realms and it mapped them onto the human psyche and the human spirit. And they said, actually, like the inner work that we have to do, that we can do on ourselves is actually deeply spiritual work. And it's a core Jewish spiritual practice. And that by affecting that healing work in ourselves and supporting others in doing that healing work is actually can affect change in the supernal realms. And it's actually core to what it means to be a Jew, which was not true in most of Judaism, right? Like this was like a, I would call it psycho-spiritual Torah or psycho-spiritual Judaism. And so that was an incredible revolution, starting with the Baal Shem Tov and then going through many generations. I would say like Hasidism, as you kind of intimated, 5-6 generations after the founders really ossified into very different from what its founders had envisioned. And I think that started when it became more of a lineage. But anyways, so Jewish renewal is really, in many ways, there's a big Venn diagram between what's Jewish renewal and what's called neo-Hasidism, which is this movement to take those beautiful psycho-spiritual teachings of Hasidism and bring them to people who are not Orthodox, who do not have a traditional Orthodox practice, and who do not live in those sort of cloistered communities in Williamsburg or in these Hasidic enclaves, and to take it and to bring it into a more progressive worldview, into a more egalitarian worldview, into more inclusive and more universalist, not this kind of Jewish exceptionalist worldview that is common from that time period. So anyways, I do think that Jewish renewal is inextricably tied with neo-Hasidism, and we can talk more about that. To go back to your question about the future of Jewish renewal, I think in many ways, Jewish renewal has been the victim of its own success, which is that so much of what were innovations in the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s, like have now been innovations of Jewish renewal have now been really adopted by a lot of many different, I would say all the denominations in Jewish world. Jewish renewal brought in a lot of this kind of Jewish mindfulness revolution, zeitgeist, renaissance, probably the right word, Jewish mindfulness renaissance that we're seeing now. And you and I met in one of those spaces, like that really, I think, is accredited to, I think Jewish renewal really helped drive that as well. And so I think that in many ways, Jewish renewal was successful. So to the point where you're like, okay, well, like, what is uniquely renewal if so much of that stuff is in lots of different synagogues? I think it's an open question as to what is the future of Jewish renewal. You definitely see there's like a new generation of Jewish renewal leaders that are doing amazing things out in the world. And the question is whether those people, even if they were trained in renewal seminaries or through renewal programs, are they going to sort of organize under the banner of Jewish renewal? Last week, I was at Ohala, which is the annual clergy conference of Jewish renewal. And, I don't mean to say this in any dismissive way, but the vast majority of people there were in the boomer generation.
One of the reasons why, there's many reasons, but let's just niche it down to one reason why, let's say, the reform movement has grown so much, or conservative or Orthodox in America, is camps, right? Is youth movements, right? And so that's something I haven't seen so much in the renewal world, and I think that obviously plays a part in the future, like you referenced.
Well, renewal doesn't really see itself as a denomination, right? Or for sure, Zalman's vision was not that it would be a denomination, but you'd have renewal Orthodox rabbis and renewal conservative rabbis and renewal reform, and that it was never meant to be an alternative to those denominations, but something that would sort of get seeded into those denominations. And I think that has been true. And a lot of renewal rabbis are working in synagogues and communities of other denominations. But I also think that, there's, Zalman used to always say that it's not called Jewish renewed, it's called Jewish renewal, in that we need to keep renewing ourselves. And so I do think for renewal to keep remaining fresh and relevant, there needs to be a new generation of people that come in and keep pushing the movement forward. A lot of that what was vanguard in the 80s and 90s has now just become, par for the course. And so I think that like they are, so I think there's this question of, is there a new generation that's coming in to do that? And does the new generation feel connected to renewal as a organizing structure for the next turning? And I think that, an argument can be made that, all right, like renewal got us to where we are today, and maybe it's time for something else, right? Is there like a new Jewish renewal, right? Is there a new version, or can renewal reinvent itself in a way that allows it to continue being the banner for the next turning?
It's so interesting. One of my classes I'm taking right now is about mysticism, which I'm very excited about, very passionate about in general. And one of the sort of defining qualities of a mystic or a mystical experience is going beyond the boundaries of what is normally experienced, right? And so as a mystic, you are pushing your boundaries, and in a sort of a similar vein, right? Like you were just saying, it's because renewal is in its essence definitely deeply connected to mystical traditions, right? And so it's pushing its normative boundaries, it remains in renewal. But when it becomes normative, like you just said, then it just is something else, right? And so how to continue to push the boundaries forward and in that sense progress is really the question that you're unpacking.
And I will say, yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think that, first of all, I think Judaism is a very innovative religion. And
Absolutely.
I think Judaism's greatest strength is not, there are some people who have more of a conservative worldview who say, well, Judaism's greatest strength is that, like, when the world is kind of moving fast and constantly changing, Judaism is this force of like stability and tradition, right? And that like we don't just blow with the wind and sort of follow the zeitgeist, like we stick to our tradition, and that's Judaism's strength. And I don't think that's true. I don't think that's historically accurate. I think it's a neat little narrative, but I don't think it's accurate if you look at the ways that the incredibly radical ways in which Judaism has shifted and changed and grown and evolved over the past couple thousand years. And there's a number of books that make very compelling cases that, and thinkers and scholars who make compelling case that actually Judaism's greatest strength is its ability to innovate, and that its flexibility, its creativity, its openness to change is that what has enabled it to be successful for so long. And so I think that as we, those of us who think of ourselves as Jewish innovators or Jewish entrepreneurs, like we come from a long lineage, like that is actually the most Jewish thing that one can do. And so I agree with you that there needs to be constant, thinking about constantly changing and refreshing and meeting the moment that we're in, while being deeply grounded in our ancestral wisdom. Like our tradition has so much to offer in that regard.
I love it. Yes. Oh gosh, we could talk for hours about that idea. But there's a couple other questions I want to get to, which is now you're planted in Chochmat Halev. What is your vision for the community there?
Yeah, so I've been the spiritual leader there for almost 3 years, which is crazy. And I really did not want to be a synagogue rabbi. When I went to rabbinical school, I actually told a bunch of friends of mine, I'm like, I need you to hold me accountable. Like I do not want to go work at a synagogue. Like that is, where Jewish creativity and Jewish life goes to die. I had just left Meta in 2022, and I was taking a little bit of a sabbatical, and that's when the previous spiritual leaders at Chochmat had retired. And it was just it felt like a kind of sign from the universe where I was like, a bunch of people, 10 different people forwarded me the job posting. I was like, no, not interested, not interested, not interested. And then finally I was like, okay. And someone from the search committee called me, and I was like, okay, like I hear this message from the universe. It is this sort of like interesting time that I'm actually not employed. Like how fortuitous is this? And I was planning on going back to work in tech. I was just taking off a couple months. And so I was a little bit dragged kicking and screaming into it. And part of it was during my interview process, I committed to myself to be as authentic as possible and just be totally honest and be my true self. Because one of the reasons I didn't want to be a synagogue rabbi is I just noticed with a lot of my friends who are synagogue rabbis that you kind of have to create this like fake persona to be a rabbi, then you have this bifurcation of like your authentic self and your rabbi self. And I just didn't want to do that. It's not what I was interested in. I was like, all right, I'm going to just be my total weird, crazy self. And throughout the interview process, and if for some reason they like me, then that's a sign that I can take this job and be my authentic self. And so that's what happened. And I was like, okay, well, if you want all of this, like, I'll give it a try. And it's been amazing. I mean, Chochmat is an amazing place. It's been around for about 30 years. Actually, this year we're celebrating our 30th anniversary. It started as a Jewish meditation center, one of the first ones, at least first modern ones that we know of, and had a teacher training and trained many of the people who are leading the Jewish mindfulness renaissance that we're seeing now. A lot of them came out of that Chochmat program. And it slowly evolved into something that resembles more of a synagogue. I still don't refer to us as a synagogue, but the community was coming out of, like a lot of synagogues, was in a rough place coming out of COVID. A lot of, lost a lot of members. A lot of people were not wanting to pay membership in synagogues when a lot of people didn't like Zoom. And the previous spiritual leaders at Chochmat did an amazing job of holding the community together and offering during COVID and offering a lot of just like deep spiritual counseling and pastoral counseling and support, which is, I think, at the essence what Jewish communities can offer. And, and I think, they've said that one of the reasons they retired is they were just so burnt out by COVID. But also, when I took on the role at Chochmat, I told the board, I said, I'm not actually convinced that Chochmat needs to exist. Because when Chochmat was started, it was really one of the only games in town. We had Kehila and we had Aquarian Minyan and other sort of renewal institutions, but it was really on the vanguard, and there wasn't that much creative Jewish expression happening in Berkeley. But now we've just got, I think that the East Bay is one of the richest Jewish communities in the world, if not the rich, meaning in terms of depth and quality and levels of creativity and engagement and just sort of the full gamut of Jewish expression. And so many organizations have popped up since Chochmat was started. And I was like, maybe the fact that that membership at Chochmat is dwindling and declining is a signal that like the Jewish East Bay landscape is overly saturated and we don't need a place like Chochmat. And it's been a wild 3 years where our membership has more than doubled since I joined 3 years ago. We get, hundreds of people our capacity in our sanctuary is 300 people. And on Friday nights, like we are at max capacity, for example, like Shabbat morning, tomorrow, is today Friday? Yes. Our Shabbat morning service tomorrow, we close registration because we have 300 people registered and we can't fit any more people, and it's free, but we can't fit any more people in the building. And so I think there is there's an incredible sense of momentum where people are looking for what Chochmat Halev has to offer. And I think that people are hungry for a Judaism that is both deeply authentic and rooted in traditional texts and liturgy and ritual, but is also modern and progressive, that's meaningful, that I think, offers like what I would call like a grown-up vision of God. It's not like an old man in the sky who's like sitting on his throne and wagging his finger at you and writing down all of your good and bad deeds in a book, right? And I think that people want a more sophisticated version of God that we offer, and people don't want to talk about God, or learn about God. People want to experience God, and that's something that we focus a lot on at Chochmat. I think people want a place that's really inclusive, where whether you grew up in the Orthodox yeshiva world or you just, you converted to Judaism, or you have no Jewish background, or you're not even Jewish, everyone along that spectrum can feel like they belong at Chochmat. Interfaith families, LGBT family, Jews of color, and that not only they belong, but it's accessible and meaningful. And I think people want a place that's fun, that brings joy back into services, that's a little bit subversive, that's a little bit naughty, that is provocative, and that brings some whimsy and delight back into Jewish practice. And so, we got 300 people who are up there dancing and singing and dripping in sweat and just having a great time, and then going really deep into contemplative practice, going deep inside. It's not uncommon to see tears streaming down people's faces during some of those more internal oriented parts of our service. And so you go on, you take people on a whole journey. And I think particularly coming out of COVID, people are hungry for that level of depth, meaning, and community. And particularly what I would say is intergenerational community, right? Because I think there's a lot of siloing right now in the Jewish world, where you've got your elders over here, and you've got your young families over here, and you've got your young professionals over there. And I think actually all of those groups are people who want to have deeper connection across the generations. And so having like a genuinely multi-generational community is something that people are hungry for as well. And so I feel really lucky to be at like one of the few synagogues that is like thriving in that. Like, it's funny because like our staff is always really stressed out about, when are we going to hit capacity? We're always like looking at registration at our events and seeing like when we have to shut down registration. And it's like, how do we fit more people in the room? And like, are we breaking fire code? And I always have to remind our staff, I'm like, guys, there are like most synagogues in the country would kill to have this problem, right? That we like don't have enough room for all the people who want to come to our events. And so I feel grateful to be in a community that is struggling with that problem.
Oh, I love it. So great. Just real quick, my first davening experience at Chochmat Halev was Ne'ilah, where there was it's the last service of Yom Kippur, in case that word didn't mean anything. And there was 10 people there. It was myself and my girlfriend at the time, and Jos and Avram and his wife, and Nanfin Geffen, and a couple other like leaders. And then I joined the band, really kicking and screaming. And I saw the community grow to exactly what you're talking about. 400 people coming every Friday night and dancing and schwitzing and the whole thing. Really to see the power of how community could grow so quickly. And it's so nice to hear that it's happened again. And so, Yasher Koach.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. We had, over 1,200 people at High Holidays this year. And we're already having conversations of like, do we need to find a new venue for High Holidays, right? And there is some interesting conversations to be had about, is bigger better, and like, we don't all have to aspire to be a mega church, right? And how do you maintain that intimacy and connection, which I think is really at its heart what brings most people to Jewish community. Is they just want to be seen, they want to be held, they want to be known, they want to make their friends there, they want to be able to connect with other people. And so how do you maintain that during a period of growth, which is something that we've really been working a lot on. And we actually we hired a new role, we created a new role and hired an amazing person to be our community weaver, whose full-time job is to help people. How do you plug into this community? How do you go from just attending services to building deep connections and relationships here and building deep spiritual practice? I attribute a lot of our growth to that, where it's not just about, having amazing services, but it's like the services gets people in the door, but what keeps people in the door is the deep relationships and the deep spiritual experiences that people can have together.
I love it. What a great role. I think every shul should have a community weaver to weave together the generations and
Absolutely.
That's a great idea. Okay, so a couple of things I want to ask you. So you also either founded or are part of the Jewish Mindfulness Collective, which I'm not sure if that is within the umbrella of Chochmat or if that's its own thing, since we met in that context. Talk a little bit about that and what your vision is for that.
About 2 years ago, so coming out of COVID, I was talking to a friend of mine named Rebecca Schisler, who you might know. She's an amazing meditation teacher, mindfulness teacher, and teacher of Jewish wisdom at the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, IJS. And we were we're both kind of longtime meditation practitioners, and we were coming out of COVID, and we were saying, we kind of miss meditating with other people. And it's, nice meditating over Zoom or just meditating by ourselves, but like there's a flavor of practice that is unique to being in a room with other people. As you and I met in that space, even though we didn't talk, there's like a beautiful connection that comes being in that contemplative space with other people. And so we just like put out a message on our Facebook walls and like, on to a couple of different email lists. We're like, hey, like, who wants to come meditate with us? And so we decided to keep it very simple, where we're going to meet up once a week, and we created a WhatsApp group, and anybody can join the WhatsApp group. And then there's just a Google Doc where every week you can sign up to host. You can host it at your house. You can sign up to be a host, and you can sign up to be a leader. And it's very lightly facilitated. And so we start with like a 5-minute maximum, like kavanah or teaching or intention setting. And then we meditate in silence for 30 minutes. And then we end with like maybe like a closing blessing. And then if people want to stay, we go around the circle and people can share about what came up in their meditation practice. And then sometimes we have like a potluck dinner afterwards. And it's grown from being like just Rebecca and I to now we have 200 people in the WhatsApp group, and we meet every Wednesday night at people's houses all across the Bay. Sometimes it's at Chochmat, and sometimes it's at people's houses. And it's just been so wonderful to see. And sometimes we get last time I hosted, I think there were 30 people there. And it's so simple, right? Like you don't need to overcomplicate it. You don't need a whole program around it. It's just like, just come together and meditate. And it's become this beautiful community. We do holiday celebrations together. We did a great Hanukkah party, and people have made deep friendships there. And a lot of, there are some people involved in Chochmat or other Jewish communities who are part of it, but there are a lot of people for whom Shevet is their primary Jewish community. Shevet, which is what we call it, it's a pun because it means Shevet means tribe in Hebrew, but it also means to sit. So it's been just really cool watching it grow, and really cool watching it like take on a life of its own that like it kind of runs on autopilot, which is very cool. And so so it's a community that I really cherish. And for selfish reasons, like Rebecca and I just wanted to sit with other people, and so we made it happen. And it's great to see that there's hunger and appetite for that.
Amazing. And if people are, I guess, mostly in the East Bay, and since it's all in person, they want to connect to you, is that something people should just reach out to you, or how would someone get involved with that?
Yeah, just you can shoot me a message on Instagram. It's just like @zkrieger, or you can go to my website, which is zvikakrieger.com, to send me a message, and I'm happy to just add people to the WhatsApp group. And then all the instructions are in the group description, and so you can just join the community. It's very open, inclusive, welcoming community.
Amazing. Okay, and we'll have your website linked below in case you didn't know how to spell Zvika inherently. Wrapping up here, the question I always ask everyone that's a guest on the Holy Sparks podcast is this. Zvika, what does the Jewish world need now most, and why?
Oh, that's a good question. There are so many different ways that I could answer that. But I would say that the Jewish world, or what the world needs most, that I think Judaism can really offer, is what I call, and what I've referenced earlier in this podcast, as psycho-spiritual Torah, which is that like Jewish wisdom as a vehicle for healing. We have so many people who are walking around this world, suffering from trauma, dealing with all sorts of wounding. I mean, to be human is to carry wounds around with us. And I think in its worst manifestation, Judaism has been a cause of wounding and trauma for many people. And I think that Judaism has really unique wisdom and tools to offer for healing our wounds, healing trauma. And I think that's what people are hungry for right now. And so I think that getting those parts of the Jewish tradition out there, excavating them, translating them, clearing off some of the socially conservative crud that's been layered on top of them that make it difficult for modern progressive people to access them, and bringing that out into the world, I think it can be a really big gift to the world. And I think it can be a big gift to Jewish communities and spiritual seekers of all stripes.
That was definitely a unique answer in all the many, many, many dozens of times that I've asked that question. So I thank you for that. And I always want to end with the blessing that Hashem should really bless you, that your gift should continue to shine into communities where you are obviously part of the reason why they are thriving. It's bringing your full your full self to all these communities is allowing other people to bring them their full selves as well. And that's a great gift that you bring naturally because it's who you are. And that really people should find not only in your work in Chochmat and Shevet as well, but a place where they can achieve this psycho-spiritual healing, which we all desperately need, right? Tikkun olam, it should start with tikkun nefesh, the repairing of our own souls. And that you're doing great work in the world, and I'm grateful to know you, and I'm so glad that we were able to meet in silence and come out of that silence with this deep connection. So you should keep blessing people to bring them home, and I'm grateful to be in contact with you.
Amen, amen. Ken Tehi Ratzonah. May it be her will. So grateful to have this connection. And thanks for the opportunity to ponder your insightful questions and looking forward to having more opportunities to connect and further explore these topics.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning into this week's episode of the Holy Sparks podcast. This is Salke with Rabbi Zvika Krieger. Shabbat Shalom.